Today we're talking about inverse trig functions, and so this will rely heavily on your memory of our exact values. So I've gone ahead and on the screen rewritten the table for the cosine and sine of the 30, 45, and 60 degree angles. And so I want to remind you of a problem we've had before, and that is to find theta so that the sine of theta is 1/2. And so we remember we worked backwards here. We looked for where the sine was 1/2, and we said, oh, that's the 30 degree reference angle. And then we knew between 0 and 360 there was one other angle that had a sine of 1/2. So we went into the second quadrant where the sine is also positive. Okay, you remember how to do that. So here's the new stuff. Now we're going to have an equation, specifically a function, and this is called the inverse sine function. All right, and so we're doing something similar to this. I want to make sure you're clear that when we have sine to the -1, we're doing the process backwards. So what we used to do is say find the sine of 30, and we would say that's 1/2, right? So in this case we're going to say tell me the angle that has a sine of 1/2. All right? And so here's the problem we run into. We cannot have two answers, right? So from the problem above, we found that both the sine of 30 and 150 both give us 1/2. The problem is, in order to be a function, each input has to have exactly one output. Exactly one output. And so you can see that the input of 1/2 with the inverse sine function gives us an output, two different ones, all right? And so the correct answer to this question is only 30. So you're wondering, well, how do I know that? And so in class, we're going to spend quite a bit of time developing the inverse sine function. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you that, and I'll explain this more in class, the inverse sine function looks like this, right? So this is the x and this is the y. And so the x values will be between 1 and -1, right? And the y values, we are only, ooh, that wasn't good. We are only looking from +90 down to -90. All right? If we continue this further, then we're going to run into this problem that we get two outputs for one input. All right? So what we say is that we'll always put in for x values between -1 and 1, and the outputs can only be from -90 to 90 degrees. Right? So that is the range of this function. All right, so what we've done is we've restricted the range. So when we ask any kind of inverse sine function, right, and so let's say it's, for instance, a negative, what about -1/2, right? So I want to find that. So I cannot go up here into that third quadrant. I have to go between 0 and -90, and so the solution is -30 degrees. All right, we also have an inverse cosine function, right? And for this one, we have a different range. So real quickly, I'm going to draw a graph of the inverse cosine function. And this also goes from -1 to 1 on the x-axis. But here, we're going to go from 0 in degrees to 180 in degrees for answers. All right? So the range of the inverse cosine is 0 to 180. So these are the only two things that trip us up on this part. Otherwise, we're simply doing what we did before, and that is going back to this table and working backwards. All right, see you in class, and we'll practice this a lot.